Thanks, Daniel. I'm going to do something slightly different to previous years. I normally talk about infrastructure and technical things, but I figure the first slot after lunch, you're going to struggle to stay awake. So I'm going to do something sort of slightly less tangible, shall we say. I'm going to take a leaf out of the Duffett school of let the geek speak, and I have prizes for good questions and good interjections. So we've got some of our limited edition T-shirts and insulated bottles, should anybody be interested. So, if you study the theory and you look at the various ISO guides and things, there's two very clear worlds. You identify you've got a problem, and then you look at how it happened. And there's absolutely nothing for what the hell you do at 3 o'clock in the morning when everything's not working. Now, I've spent 20-something years, to put it another way, swimming in shite. And I think that's taught me a fair few things. As Jared said, not 10 minutes ago, you learn from the mistakes you make rather than the things you do right. And I've made loads of mistakes, and I've also been incredibly unlucky. I've had data centers explode and wipe out an entire rack of stuff. I've had primary and secondary sands both fried at exactly the same time. Anything that could go wrong, I've had. And I hope to try and impart some of the lessons from that. But also a phase of my life that I don't really talk about much. I spent 15 years doing mountain rescue as a sort of volunteer outside my work, and did some pretty massive incidents. This was one where, in between the actual search and rescue stuff, I was on the international news for the best part of a week regarding what turned out to be a murdered child. But in that role, I've had the privilege of working with some fantastic leaders, from the police right the way through to elite military units, and they've all taught me something. So I had this idea in my head that, together with my experience and some of the leadership theory, it might make an interesting presentation. I could be completely wrong, but I'll let you be the judge of that. So, it's story time. It seems the easiest way to impart some of this. And I'd like to tell you a story about Mr. Black. Now, names have been protected or changed to protect the innocent, because Mr. Black is in the room. Don't let that make you feel uncomfortable about ridiculing him. Go for it. He's kindly given me permission to relay his very bad week, which was Astrakhan last year. So we got to observe this as it unfolded throughout the conference. As you can imagine, No, it wasn't the fault of Astrakhan. No, Astrakhan and Sangoma companies were not implicated in any way, shape, or form. But no, Mr. Black chose being the other side of the world to be the perfect opportunity to make critical infrastructure changes, and it didn't go quite the way that he planned. But at the time, whilst we enjoyed ridiculing him for the best part of the week, and in the end got involved and helped him, I was kind of envious, because I remember 20 years ago being able to hack something about at a weekend and it be in production on a Monday and think, rubbish, let's throw that away and have something different for Tuesday. So I was kind of envious of him being in that position. Mr. Black runs a small ITSP. His infrastructure is quite small. He was based on, I think it was a single host running VMware with Asterisk web services, databases, all pfSense, all in the same place. And business was good. Business was really good. So we thought, it's so good, let's move it all to the cloud, because that feels like the logical thing to do. So he picked up his databases and his web services, and he threw them up on AWS. Threw them up being a technical term. And while he was at it, because we all do this, don't we? We make changes, and they've gone well. So we think, well, just make a few more while we're at it. He added some more Lua SQL queries. Went to bed. And the next day, things didn't pan out quite as he'd expected. His asterisk was locking, so he had failed call connections, failed registrations to carriers, and when calls were going through, he was having quality issues. And at this point, and here's a prize, what do you think he should have done? Oh, I haven't got limited edition, limited number here. Who was first? All right, who said they were first? Tori. Yeah. Or do you want a T-shirt, Tori? You've probably already got one, haven't you? Well, Mr. Black didn't think rolling back was sexy enough. So now, you may laugh, but we've all been here, right? This problem cannot possibly be to do with anything that we've done, because that was 3 days ago, and the tests were all fine. We must have discovered some bug that nobody else has had, that there's no evidence of in GitHub, there's no patches, but it must be fixed in a later version. So what harm can be done by upgrading? I know I've done it, and I can see from some of the uncomfortable bum shuffles that some of you have done it as well. That didn't help. So he then did the other thing that we do, which is blame the person that's responsible for the thing that we don't understand. Right? Must be their fault. They must have made changes to the network concurrently with this thing that can't possibly have affected it, because all the tests were okay. So he opened a ticket with his colo provider, and all was good. But the issues continued. So he then started to think about how he could address this. Note the days counting up at the top. I forgot to point that out. So this is day 2 of his customers being affected. So he then thought, well, maybe it was those extra queries that I added. So he removed them, and he started to suspect something bandwidthy, networky. So he thought, well, let's take the asterisk off my virtual cluster and let's move that somewhere else. So he started building that off-site. And then he thought, well, hell, yeah, I did actually move the database to AWS, so let's move it back again. Of course, he'd also moved the web services, but he left those there because that was dangerous. And the quality issues continued, but because he'd now moved the database back to his local environment, but his web services were up at AWS, he had the new problem that all of the queries were slow. So what did he do? Anybody? And the prize for the next suggestion.
Did he move the database back to AWS?
You can have a prize anyway. No, it was the weekend. So
there is an entire weekend.
He took a couple, and this may give some clues to which part of the world he's from, but I won't go there. But yeah, so he took a couple of days off, and sod customers, they'll be all right. So come the next week, the quality issues continued. So he then decided to move the database back to AWS again, but actually let's kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Let's also have a local copy. And to make that work, so we could do local reads, but keep the writes in sync, he wrote a custom script that would keep them all in sync. The quality issues continued. So he then embarked on a full rewrite of all his Lua SQL stuff in ARI, and went around this cycle again of let's just upgrade the firewall, because he was seeing evidence of duplicate packets in some of the traces. Now, I don't want to indulge too much, and I don't want to overstate this too much. So to grossly understate it, he then groveled, begging for some assistance. And ever the nice guy I am, I helped him out. So it sounded kind of networky. It sounded related to what he'd done. So we got him to compare network traffic to how it had looked before he actually touched anything. And it turned out he was actually using five times the bandwidth he was before, and he was hitting soft limits in his virtual PF sense that he'd never hit before. Of course, that was exaggerated by having this off-net database that had previously been local. And apparently it was all due to codec reordering, which came from upgrading *11 to *15, which was nothing whatsoever to do with the original problem. So we sorted it out. But I think there's some lessons there that we can all learn. So to move on to some of the leadership theory and how it might relate to this stuff. And you'll see some very militaristic words in here. Like I say, I've had the privilege of working with great leaders in that space and read lots of books on the subject. I don't profess to be an expert on any of this. I'm still learning and trying to put some of this into practice in my own business, but I thought it was relevant to share. This concept of ownership. Who here has seen an alert and sat back and waited for somebody else to deal with it?
Yep.
Okay. This is very honest of you. That's more hands than I would expect. Who here has dived on an alert that may have been somebody else's problem, but they thought they could help? Okay. Slightly more hands, actually, but interestingly, different people. There's this concept of ownership, and there's a great book, if you want to read, called Extreme Ownership, which, to put in one sentence, is everything is your fault. And the sooner you realize that, the better life will be. And if you can actually just embrace that and get on with managing up and down the hierarchy in your organization, life will be a lot easier. And this is a JB one, but he's unfortunately not here. I won't attempt the accent, but this is something he's banged on about over numerous years. Selection and maintenance of the aim. The leader's job, particularly in an outage situation, even if you're the only one dealing with it, is to decide what you're fixing. What's the aim? That's the selection. And then to maintain that aim. Because an outage is not the time to fix the indentation in somebody else's commit that you happen to notice is slightly off when you're fixing the issue. It's really tempting because it's a distraction from what you're supposed to be doing, gives you a bit of brain space, but it really isn't the time. And I find, with my team that when we have an issue, and thankfully they're rare, that this is probably one of my biggest responsibilities, just keeping them focused on what they're supposed to be doing, just resisting that urge to upgrade something that's unrelated or change something that's nothing to do with what the actual problem is. Which brings me to that, simplification. There's something about technical people, some might call it arrogance, that it cannot possibly be to do with what we've changed. It has to be somebody else's fault. It has to be a bug that nobody else has ever experienced. It can't possibly be to do with that one-line code, that one-line config change we made the day before. Nothing to do with that. You need to keep things simple and realistic. It probably is. And again, coming back to ownership, the sooner you realize that, the easier life will be. And finally, in the heat of the moment, because I've spent a number of years being the guy with nobody else to go to. But even if you're part of a team or you have a team under you, there can sometimes be an overwhelming amount of things to deal with. You need to prioritize and you need to execute. And focusing on the most important one and dealing with it, and focusing on the next important one and dealing with that will get you through. But sometimes you need to take a slight step back and realize that there's other things that have to run in parallel. So your most important task might not be fixing the database. It might be tasking somebody with building a new one from a backup from the previous night, because that's going to take 12 hours and you don't want to start that process in 12 hours' time when what you're doing hasn't worked. Decentralized command. This was something that Mountain Rescue taught me really well, where we were a mix of people from all walks of life, from CEOs through to school teachers and DIY people, but we all came together on the hill to save lives. And how it basically worked, how an incident would typically work, is your incident manager would be sitting in a van at the bottom of the hill, and he'd task everybody to go off up the mountain, searching for somebody or to a particular place, looking for the ill casualty. But then as soon as the MISPA or the casualty was located, command would completely shift, and the person that was on the scene would become in charge of the whole incident. The incident controller would move effectively from the van to the other person. And that was really powerful for me. There was no rigid hierarchy like you see in some organizations. It was really kind of fluid. And that can be really, really valuable in an outage situation within a business. You've got to empower the people that are at the coalface dealing with things to do what they need to do, to make the calls that they need to make. And you've got to support them in doing so. Not everything can feed back through that incident controller. But that incident controller also has to take a step back and be able to see the whole picture. If he's the guy that is there in config files and messing with servers in racks, he's going to miss the bigger picture. Sometimes that's necessary. Some people tell you leadership's about telling other people what to do. Other people will tell you that leadership is about being the guy that's the first one in. I will tell you it depends, and it depends on the situation. The leader should either be at the front or at the back or anywhere in the middle, wherever it's most effective for his team at that time. But fundamentally, he needs to see the big picture, the whole incident. What does this mean for the business, not just the fine level detail of that particular config file. Oops. So what could Mr. Black have done to do this differently? You've seen my talks before, so you'll have seen me present this slide God knows how many times. The 7 layers of OSI, namely everything traversing our networks and applications goes through all 7. Usually more than once, and each of the 7 are often deeper than they're presented there, particularly in virtual environments where you can have virtual networks on virtual networks and virtual machines on those. But we tend to obsess at layer 7. Yeah? Take Mr. Black's example. He'd made a fairly fundamental change, and he assumed it was software related up here. It was actually down here. And I find when I have a really annoying habit now within our business that if there's an issue, I can generally say where it is, and that comes from, like I say, donkey's years of swimming in unmentionable. But it also comes from this. Every one of those layers builds on every one underneath. So if you've got a problem at layer 2, it is going to manifest itself in 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So the logical thing to do in fixing this stuff is not start at the top. It's start at the bottom. Make sure all of that is good and in order, even if it seems like it should be, and it was okay yesterday, and all these other excuses that you might give yourself for avoiding it. And Jared did a great talk at SimCon earlier in the year where he talked about basic network troubleshooting and some of the tools that are there for you to do this kind of 1 to 4 layer. The second thing he could have done is taken a step back and thought, well, what have I actually changed? And been brutally honest with himself about what he'd changed. Forget the lies, but it worked afterwards, and the unit tests were all okay, and it built okay, and all of that. Just put that to one side. What's actually changed? It was okay a week ago. It's not okay now. What's different? And that comes back to this brutal honesty with yourself that I said before. You haven't found some rare bug that nobody else has discovered. You've changed something. That is probably the cause of it. So what have you changed? And we see this time and time again with customer tickets, that generally start along the lines of, it's not working, you fix it now. And our guys will reply saying, what's the environment? What's changed? Nothing's changed. Fix it now. You need to help us here. What's changed? Well, all right, I've moved colo provider. Okay, that's a start. And we've deployed a new firewall. And then it all comes spilling out. But you need to fix it. So be honest with yourself, because you can have those same arguments in your own head. And resist I must fix that while you're at it. We've all done it. I know I've done it. And sometimes, actually, it's worked out okay. I'd say they're the minority. Most of the time, it just makes things worse. And so, let's tell another story. And this is Mr. Black's non-event. I might get some of these printed, because this would be the sequel. So we start out as we did before. Business is great. Let's move to the cloud. Now, actually, I disagree with that, but I've made that presentation before. But anyway, he moves his main database and his APIs to the cloud. We can't stop him, so he goes ahead and he adds these additional Lua SQL queries. And then he has the same outcome, asterisk locking, fail call connections, quality issues. So he moves the additional Lua queries again. Issue resolved. He was aware of what he changed, and he rolled it back. I forget who it was that said quite early on. And one of the things I do in this kind of situation is I keep, not a diary, not a journal, that sounds a bit kind of poncy, but if I change anything in config or I have anything changed in config, I keep a chronological list of everything that's done. And then as we do sort of mini rollbacks throughout it, I'm crossing those off. So at any one time, I can see almost the state of what's changed since we started on the incident. So, and how am I doing for time? Ooh, that's okay. That brings me to the end of my outage presentation. But I've now got something completely different to talk about. Earlier in the year, so Simwood, we have a conference of customers called SimCon. And that took place in, was it February? Yeah, that took place in February at our office in Bristol in the UK. And we decided to have some awards. And these awards, we're kind of seeding them, but we want them to become more of an industry thing. And I have an issue with awards because, and we've never entered any for this precise reason. One, you nominate yourself. Two, when you're shortlisted, you get invited to buy a dinner package so that all your customers can be there when you might win. And then three, you're invited to buy an advertising package to tell everybody about this award that you might have won. It's just dirty. So in the spirit of open source, we wanted some awards that recognize the kind of the unsung heroes in the community and in industry. It's not just an open source thing. The people that would never think of entering themselves. So one of the rules is you can't nominate yourself. You can only nominate other people. And there's nothing commercial about it other than the fact we're kind of seeding it. So like I say, they took place at SimCon. And we had the lovely Rachel Riley, who's, you probably won't know if you're outside the UK, but quite well known on TV, come along and help me present them. And there was two people that had to come in by video, and because they couldn't be there. And that was a challenge because we had to keep them separate. And I pulled off a bit of a coup in terms of deception because they each came in thinking they were presenting the award to the other. And it was only when they were brought on stage or on video on stage that they realized that they weren't. And I promised, given that they're both here, that I would bring the actual awards with me today. So the first one, we had Daniel come in by video. The first one is the Kamailio project and Daniel Constantine Merler for open source excellence. And if you want to actually see the full, I'm not going to go through the whole spiel, but if you want to see the full videos and the presentations themselves, they're there at that UI. But Daniel, if you're about. There we are. Congratulations. You're welcome. Now, the second one was for somebody that we described as a pre-posthumous legend, recognizing that the best people only get told they're the best people when they're not around anymore. And this person is so special in our community that we wanted to tell him we love him while he's still here. And that pre-posthumous legend was Fred Posner.
Yes.
We did have one of Fred crying, but we didn't think that was fair. There's a little ad for you, Fred. And with that, I'm done, except the note. We're always hiring, so talk to us outside.
Okay. I love your talks. They're always brilliant, and I always understand them. And I know so little about this stuff. But I do have a question for you. When you evoke the different, what changed, you're not saying any of the obvious external factors, like the rat ate into the fiber, or we passed from 1999 to 2000,
Yep.
or it froze last night. So these are all...
There is that, but as soon as you go through your 7 layers of OSI, you'll just...
start on layer 1, you
Yep.
got the freezing and the rats.
Yep, you'll discover that fairly quickly. But in my experience, the rats may be the 0.1%, but the fat fingers are the 99%. And the sooner we acknowledge that and accept that it was probably our fault and ask what we changed, the quicker we'll sort it. Torri.
I'm right on the piss beforehand.
Just slightly confused about the issue with Mr. Black, because you said that there was a layer 2 issue that was caused by the asterisk 11 to asterisk 15 migration, causing the codec order to be wrong, so consuming 5x bandwidth, causing the level 2 layer. But then you said the original root cause was the Lua SQL scripts. How is that? How are the Lua scripts causing audio quality issues on the network?
He'd moved database and web services off net, so he'd increased his bandwidth egressing and egressing through his PF sense. So he's hitting a soft limit in that, which was then exaggerated by asterisk 11 to asterisk 15 reordering the codecs. So it just made the original problem made it even worse. So then when he rolled back the first problem, it didn't fix it because the exaggeration was still in place, I think.
Okay, so thank you, Simon, and
Thank you.
special thanks for the awards.